The story of Ruth and Naomi that we heard read this morning is one of my favorites. And I love that we spent time to read a full chapter this morning, and I want to talk about it some more. It's one of the most famous stories of companionship in the Bible, and it's also often used in weddings. In fact, if you've gone to a Christian, specifically an evangelical wedding, it's probably about a 50-50 chance you heard it used in that service. It's really, really popular. But it's actually not a romantic story. In fact, it's actually not even a story about friendship, really. I think that the story of Ruth and Naomi is a story that's about faithfulness. I'll try to tell you why. So Naomi is from Judah, which is the southern part of Israel, and she's widowed in the story, and then both of her sons have died, and no other children are mentioned. So in that time, in that culture, Naomi would have been an incredibly vulnerable person. Because the way the world was structured then is that the men were the only ones who could really provide, who could really earn a living. Now, it was true that sometimes some women would work the fields, and we actually see that a little bit later in Ruth's story, but Naomi was probably too old for that. And without a husband, without a son, those would have been her sole providers, and she's left alone. There's literally no system in place for her. In fact, we actually start to see, and if we read the rest of the book of Ruth, this becomes kind of one of the core principles as Ruth and Naomi together go off to trying to find a man who will protect them, who will provide for them, because that was so necessary in their culture. And they do it in some really interesting and subversive ways. But after that, Naomi's two sons, one of them being Ruth's husband, after they pass away, Ruth and her sister Orpah say, first, it's not Oprah, by the way, it's Orpah. I'm going to say that wrong one of these times. But Ruth and her sister Orpah, who were not Hebrew, they were Moabites, they told Naomi initially, we're going to go with you, and Naomi says, no, go back to your own people, because she knows how difficult it would be for an unmarried woman who's an outsider coming into Israel trying to find a husband. This story, in fact, comes out of a time when most scholars think the story was actually written during a time when Israel was being incredibly cruel to outsiders, specifically really strongly forbidding marriage with people who were not Israelites. So Ruth is told to go back with her sister Orpah because Naomi understands this dynamic that's going on. And they end up making two different decisions. Now, Orpah decides to go back, which makes sense. We said it'd be easier for her to remarry in her own culture. She presumably had a mother to go home to, which Naomi tells her, and she would know the land, she would know the people, she'd know their culture, she would know their religion. She would be in the religion that she grew up with. But Ruth makes a different choice. She chose to stay with Naomi, to choose her as her family, to learn about her people, and to follow her God, which is no small choice. Now, what it doesn't tell us specifically is why Ruth makes this choice. Maybe, unlike her sister, maybe she doesn't have the same type of family system to go back to. We don't know. Maybe she has learned something about Naomi's people from their time as family together, and maybe even something about Naomi's God that sounds like good news to her, something she wants to go be a part of. But for sure, I think we know that Ruth recognizes just how vulnerable Naomi is, because Ruth herself is a widow at this point. And this is something we do as human beings. Like, no matter what we're going through, when we see someone who's going through the same thing as us and then some, we have that feeling of like, oh, I can't even imagine, because I know how hard it is to do this. What if I had this and that? Whew. So Ruth recognizes the vulnerability of Naomi, and she says, no, I'm going to go with you. And this is where the famous line comes from, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And in doing so, Ruth, who is not a Hebrew woman, followed incredibly faithfully the instructions of the Hebrew God to take care of the most vulnerable people in society. Even in her own vulnerability, Ruth risked becoming more vulnerable to love someone who was more vulnerable than herself. And this choice by Ruth points us to what I think is one of the most foundational understandings of early Christianity. Not just that we are to take care of the vulnerable people in society, but recognizing that this is the world and there will always be vulnerable people in the world. Because there will always be empires, there will always be oppressors, there will always be rulers and governors and ultra wealthy, and there will always be those people that the ones in power do not care to protect. So the earliest Christians decided something. They said, these things are always going to be realities of the world. So instead of trying to change that temporarily, because it's going to come back, we realize we can do something different. We can form a type of community within the powers of empire that takes away their power, or at least protects all of us from it. A community that protects everyone that those powers don't care about, that makes sure everyone has enough food to eat, that makes sure everyone has a place to live, that everyone has enough money to pay their rent, and even their taxes. That's what the earliest church members did. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, in fact, before Christianity became adopted by the empire for the sake of its own power, the early church believed that empire is just the way of the world, but we're choosing to live in a different world, and we're going to make a different world by being together. So no matter what the empire did, they organized their entire lives around forming this type of society that protects everyone, forming a sort of haven within the empire. Now, I'm going to give you this one, that if ancient Israelites lived in a democracy like we do, I'm sure that they would try to organize. They would write letters, they would probably picket, they would campaign for representatives that would enshrine their values into the law of the empire. And it's good that we, in our modern situation, can do all of these things, which is why sometimes we talk a little bit about politics in church. This is one of our roles. Now, we're not allowed to endorse specific political candidates, at least not without having to pay some extra taxes, but it is our job to call out our leaders when they stray from the values that we see in Scripture. We do this because, well, one, the country that we live in is our country, and it's full of our people who we love. And what we see in Scripture and in history time and time again is that when these empires stray from the ways of God, they fall apart, and the collapse is a painful process. And the collapse happens in our country to our people whom we love. However, while all of these things are good, this can't be the primary purpose of the church. Speaking to politics can't be the primary purpose of the church, because our purpose is to be a very specific, very subversive, very sacred kind of community. There are some places, just for a glimpse, at St. Andrew where we're already doing this work. For example, buying Thanksgiving meals for families in need, the giving tree with Christmas gifts back there, making quilts for people all over the world, stuffing backpacks with school supplies for kids, organizing for meals that can go to people who are sick or grieving. These are all places where we're not asking the government to step in and do anything. We're saying, no, regardless of what programs are out there, what's happening, we're going to do this because we believe this is what the world needs. We see the vulnerable people, and we are walking right alongside them. This is work we're already doing. It's very good. But the question becomes then, who are the vulnerable people among us? What if we start first just inside of our church even? Who are the vulnerable people in our church, and how might we walk alongside them? How can we shape our community for the protection of these people? We have people who are physically disabled, maybe with sickness, or other disabilities, or even with age. Sometimes our body's just not doing the things that our bodies need to do for us anymore, or at least not all of them. We have people who are economically vulnerable. I'm thinking maybe about young families and parents who have to choose every single minute of their life as a choice, right? Am I going to choose to put this minute toward producing something that will make us money and help us survive in an increasingly difficult economy, or will we spend time with our family and our loved ones? Every minute is a choice. This is an economic vulnerability. And I think we have children and we have teenagers who are still figuring out who they're going to be in the world. They're emotionally vulnerable. They need space to learn and to grow and to make mistakes. They need lots of grace, and they need a whole bunch of unconditional love. And what we learn in the story of Ruth is that choosing solidarity with vulnerability and vulnerable people, it isn't easy. Because sometimes it means making ourselves even more vulnerable. And sometimes walking with someone who's vulnerable means leaving behind the way that we know in exchange for mystery, adventure, boldly stepping in to the unknown in faith. But one thing that I know for certain is we can't walk in solidarity alone. Being the church means being in community because we are relational beings. It's who we were designed to be, and it's who we were designed to be all together. It's through our relationships and the ways that we walk with one another that the love of God breaks forth into the world. So during our contemplation time after this, I hope we can all consider, who are the vulnerable people among us? Who are the vulnerable people in the world? And how can we build relationships? How can we walk in solidarity so that the love of God can shine through our community?